The morning sun in Round Rock felt too bright for morning. The church bells tolled heavy and slow, each note pressing against my chest. I clutched the folded handkerchief Henry once carried in his suit pocket, trying to draw strength from its worn fabric. Friends and neighbors approached me with solemn faces, murmuring condolences that blurred together like distant waves. But over the hymns and whispered prayers, I caught sharper voices, ones that belonged to my own family. Evangeline stood by the front pew, her black dress tailored to perfection, her lips curved in something closer to satisfaction than grief. Damien lingered behind her, tapping his phone, his eyes restless. When the final blessing ended and the crowd began to file out, Evangeline moved with a precision that sent a chill through me. She pulled a folded document from her purse and held it aloft with a theatrical sigh. "Father left this," she announced, her voice slicing through the murmur of the sanctuary. The words pulled me to my feet before I realized I had moved. The pastor froze mid-step, the congregation turning as one. Evangeline's eyes gleamed as she spread the pages across the coffin like an offering, a supplement to his will, she said smoothly. "It grants me sole authority over his estate. Everything assets, property, accounts." A low gasp traveled through the room. My throat tightened. Henry had spoken of no such thing. My fingers trembled as I reached for the paper, but Evangeline slapped her palm down to block me. She leaned close enough that only I could hear. "You don't deserve a cent," she hissed, her breath sharp with bitterness. "You were nothing without him. Now you're nothing with him gone. Get out of the house." Her words struck harder than the tolling bells ever could. Damien gave a short laugh under his breath, his smirk twisting like a knife. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the relief of a man already burying debts under the promise of my husband's fortune. The sanctuary seemed to tilt. My knees quivered, but I stayed standing, steadying myself on the coffin's edge. Henry's name, carved into the brass plate, glimmered under the stained glass light, as though he were watching, silent but unyielding. I folded the handkerchief tighter in my hand, swallowed my grief, and walked out into the Texas heat, the sound of whispered gossip chasing me down the church steps, toward a future I did not yet understand. By the time I reached the house Henry and I had built together, the driveway already felt foreign. The magnolia tree we planted on our 10th anniversary still stood tall, but even its branches seemed to bow away from me. When I opened the door, the scent of lavender polish met me too clean, too final. Boxes lined the hallway like gravestones. My dresses, photographs, even Henry's cufflinks that I had tucked carefully in a drawer, were stacked without care. Evangeline stood in the living room, arms crossed, her heels clicking once against the hardwood as though announcing her dominion. "You're old, irrelevant, and weak," she said, not raising her voice but sharpening every word. "This house is mine now. Take what you can carry and go." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. For a moment, I searched her face, hoping to see the girl I once held through fevers and heartbreaks, but her eyes were stone, trained on Damien, who lounged in Henry's chair as though he had already claimed the throne. I packed one suitcase in silence. No protest, no plea. The weight of humiliation pressed harder than the weight of the bag. When I closed the front door, it didn't sound like wood meeting a frame. It sounded like the end of an era. That night, a friend from church, Martha Redding, opened her guest house to me. The small space smelled of cedar and old hymnals, a kindness I hadn't earned but needed desperately. Lying awake on the narrow bed, I stared at the ceiling beams and let the memories flood in. I remembered working late nights beside Henry in the trucking office, my hands ink-stained from ledgers, my back aching from double shifts. I remembered Evangeline asleep on a cot in the corner, never knowing her dinner came from hours I'd carved out of my own body. The tears came hot and silent. Betrayal burned deeper than grief. But beneath it, something else stirred a pulse of defiance. Faint but alive, waiting for its moment. Martha's guest house was quiet, but sleep never came easily. Each creak of the wooden beams reminded me of all I had lost. On the third night, I decided to drive out to the old farmhouse Henry and I once used as a retreat. It had been years since I last turned its key, and dust covered the porch, but it was still ours, or so I prayed, inside. The air carried Henry's presence in every corner. His desk sat against the far wall, heavy oak scarred by decades of work. I ran my fingers along the grain, remembering the way he would lean over ledgers with his glasses slipping down his nose. In the drawer, I found only old stationery, but on the shelf above rested his prayer book, the one he never let anyone touch. As I opened it, a small brass key slid out and struck the floor with a soft chime. My breath caught. Kneeling, I held it in my palm, its weight oddly warm, as if Henry himself had placed it there for me. I tried it on the locked drawer of his desk. The tumblers turned, and the drawer slid open. Inside lay a worn leather journal and 2 sealed envelopes marked with my name. My hands trembled as I opened the journal. Henry's handwriting curved strong across the pages, though the ink sometimes blurred where his hand had pressed too hard. Entry after entry revealed what I had long suspected, but never dared to say aloud. Evangeline had asked him for loans that were never repaid. She had brought strangers into the house, appraisers circling like vultures, measuring silverware and antique furniture, while she pretended it was harmless curiosity. Henry wrote of his fears, not for the fortune, but for me. He knew her hunger would grow sharper after his death, and he worried I would face it alone. He ended one entry with a single line that made my chest ache. When the time comes, Corinna must be the one to decide what survives. I closed the journal with shaking hands, the envelopes still unopened, knowing Henry's secrets were only beginning to surface. I sat at Henry's desk until dawn, the lamplight casting long shadows across the pages of his journal, each entry cut deeper than the last. He had documented everything: the silver candelabras missing from the dining room, the sudden appearance of appraisers Evangeline invited without his consent, Damien's constant requests for money disguised as business opportunities. The numbers told a story of betrayal in black ink, meticulous and undeniable. One page stopped me cold. Henry had sketched his own signature beside a forgery he discovered on a loan document. He noted how Damien had tried to use his name to secure funds from a bank in Austin, only to be caught by a sharp-eyed clerk. "She knows," he wrote. Evangeline turned her face away as if she hadn't seen him do it. My fingers trembled as I traced the lines, my heart torn between grief and fury. For years, I had excused their carelessness, telling myself they were young, pressured, misunderstood, but Henry had seen it for what it was: theft. Plain and simple. A knock at the farmhouse door startled me. When I opened it, Miguel stood there, his weathered hat in his hands. His eyes softened when he saw the journal pressed against my chest. "Señora," he said gently, "I know what they've done. I saw her." I motioned him inside, and he spoke quietly of the funeral night. He had caught sight of Evangeline slipping a velvet pouch into her handbag, the glint of silver catching the porch light. He hadn't confronted her. Decades of service had taught him silence, but he remembered every detail. I listened, my body rigid, tears threatening but refusing to fall. For the first time since Henry's death, a strange strength rose in me. This wasn't only sentiment. This wasn't just memory. I held proof: written records, forged signatures, a witness willing to stand beside me. Closing the journal, I looked at Miguel, my voice steadier than I expected. "If Henry trusted me to decide what survives," I said, "then I must begin here." I drove into Austin with Henry's journal resting on the seat beside me, every mile heavy with doubt and determination. When I entered Dr. Ansel Wyatt's office, the weight of his gaze reminded me of the many times he had counseled Henry through storms in business. He rose, took the journal from my hands, and examined it with deliberate care. When I mentioned the supplement Will Evangeline had unveiled at the funeral, a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. He opened a drawer, pulled out the sealed original Henry had left in his custody, and laid the two side by side. The differences were glaring. Evangeline's version bore an uneven seal, the ink darker, the wording altered to remove me entirely. Wyatt adjusted his spectacles and looked at me firmly. "It's a forgery. Mrs. Hale, your husband left you everything. He trusted me to guard against exactly this." Relief and grief tangled in my chest. Before I could speak, the office door creaked open and Maribel Cruz stepped inside, clutching a folder. She had served in our home for years, quiet as a shadow, loyal as blood. Her eyes met mine with an almost apologetic sorrow. "I should have spoken sooner," she said softly, opening the folder to reveal pawnshop receipts. Each bore Evangeline's signature, each tied to items I remembered missing: a silver tea set, heirloom jewelry, even Henry's pocket watch. Miguel, who had insisted on driving me, stepped forward and placed a hand on the table. "We all saw pieces of it," he said. "Now it's time to put them together." For the first time, I felt something that resembled an army forming, though small and fragile. Ansel with his legal weight, Maribel with her records, Miguel with his steady eyes. They were not warriors, but they were mine. Yet even as we sat in that office, Evangeline's poison spread. Wyatt showed me a post she had released online, painting me as unstable, senile, and manipulated by schemers. The comments beneath stung worse than open insults, neighbors whispering doubts, acquaintances nodding along with her performance of grief. I pressed my palms flat against the folder of proof, steadying myself. Lies had traveled quickly, but truth was gathering its witnesses, and I knew our quiet circle would have to face her storm head-on. It didn't take long for Evangeline to strike back. "Dr. Wyatt called me one morning," his voice taut. "She's filed a petition in probate court," he said. "She's claiming you're mentally unfit to manage the estate." My breath caught. I had heard the whispers around town, comments from neighbors who once waved kindly, but now tilted their heads in pity. Damien had been fueling the fire, telling creditors and business partners that I was slipping, that soon everything would be in their hands. When Wyatt handed me the petition later that afternoon, I saw my name buried beneath lies, supported by a medical report from a doctor I had never met. It claimed I suffered from memory loss and confusion. Reading it felt like swallowing glass. Miguel found me in the farmhouse kitchen, staring at the papers with trembling hands. He set down a steaming mug of coffee and pulled out the chair across from me. "Señora," he said quietly, "Henry wrote everything down. That journal, it's your shield. And I will stand beside you. I saw her steal. I will swear it." His steady presence steadied me. We gathered what we had: Henry's journal with its meticulous records, Maribel's receipts showing Evangeline's thefts, and Miguel's promise of sworn testimony. Wyatt compiled it all with the precision of a surgeon, arranging the documents into a case that could breathe beneath the suffocating weight of their lies. When the day came, I walked into the courthouse flanked by Wyatt and Miguel. The marble floors echoed with each step, my pulse matching their rhythm. Evangeline and Damien were already inside, their lawyers whispering confidently at their sides. She didn't look at me as I sat, but I felt her smirk like a blade across my skin. Judge Mercer entered with measured calm. Wyatt rose first, presenting the journal and Miguel's affidavit. The judge's eyes flicked over each page, her expression unreadable. After both sides argued, she set down her pen and looked squarely at Evangeline. "This matter requires mediation," she said. "We will hear evidence in full before deciding." The gavel struck, its echo reverberating through my bones. For the first time, the fight was no longer confined to shadows. It had stepped into the light of the court. The farmhouse had become more than a refuge. It was now a war room. Wyatt pored over legal papers at the dining table. Maribel sorted through her stack of receipts, and Miguel kept a quiet watch near the door. That was when Jordan Patel arrived, a young IT consultant Henry had once trusted with his company's systems. His sharp eyes and steady voice gave me a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in weeks. Jordan carried a battered laptop, its case covered in faded stickers. He explained that Henry had encrypted a series of files years ago, leaving instructions in case of family disputes. Hearing those words spoken aloud felt like Henry himself had anticipated every betrayal. When Jordan cracked open the files, my breath caught. The first recording played Damien's voice, low and menacing. "Sign the papers." "Henry, you don't need to worry about details. I'll handle it." Henry's reply was weary but firm. "You won't use my name to cover your debts." The next file cut deeper. Evangeline's voice, sharp with disdain. "Mother can't even keep her thoughts straight. She won't know what's happening until it's over." I clenched the edge of the table, the sting of her mockery sharper than any blade. Another clip revealed them together. "Plotting signatures," Damien bragged. "I've copied his handwriting before. One more won't matter." Evangeline's laugh followed, brittle and cold. The room fell silent when the final clip ended. Wyatt looked at me with steady conviction. "This changes everything." For the first time, the scales seemed to tilt in my favor. But victory never stays unchallenged. That very evening, Evangeline released her own performance of video online, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice breaking with practiced sorrow. She called herself a grieving daughter, abandoned by a mother corrupted by money. She spoke of betrayal, of loneliness, of love denied. Within hours, comments poured in from neighbors, church members, and strangers alike, some already choosing her side. I watched the video in the farmhouse kitchen, Miguel standing silently behind me. The weight of the recordings pressed in one direction, the flood of public sympathy in another. Truth and lies now raced neck and neck, and the world seemed uncertain which to follow. The gravel crunched outside before I saw the line of cars pulling up to the farmhouse gate. Evangeline stepped out first, flawless in a tailored black suit. Damien close behind with two lawyers at his side. Cameras followed them, red lights blinking as microphones stretched forward. They wanted a spectacle, and they had brought an audience. Neighbors drifted closer, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered. Others held up phones, recording everything. I stood at the window with Wyatt and Miguel, my pulse steady despite the storm gathering outside. Evangeline's voice cut through the air, pitched just right for the cameras. "Mother, please open the gate. We only want what Father promised us." She clasped her hands as though in prayer, her eyes glistening on cue. Damien's arm circled her shoulders, completing the portrait of a wronged daughter and her loyal husband. I pressed the intercom button. "This gate stays closed." My voice surprised me with its calm. "You've taken enough already." Their lawyers raised folders, waving them for the cameras. Damien shouted about property rights, his words sharp with practiced outrage. The crowd leaned in, hungry for drama. Wyatt stepped outside, carrying a speaker he had prepared. He placed it on the fence post, his expression carved from stone. With a flick of his hand, Henry's recordings filled the air. Damien's threats, Evangeline's mocking laughter. Their talk of forged signatures, it all spilled into the open, carried on the wind. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman down the road covered her mouth. A man muttered, "So it's true." Evangeline's mask cracked in an instant. Her face twisted, rage spilling where tears had been seconds before. "Turn that off," she shrieked, lunging toward the gate. Damien tried to pull her back, but the cameras had already captured it, the fury, the slip, the truth. I stood behind the glass, Henry's journal clutched to my chest, knowing the fight had shifted again, this time in front of the whole town. The courthouse would be next. The courthouse in Austin felt colder than stone. I sat beside Wyatt, the weight of Henry's journal heavy in my lap, while Miguel, Maribel, and Jordan filled the bench behind me like a quiet wall of strength. When Judge Ione Mercer entered, the room stilled as though the very air held its breath. Evangeline rose first, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice trembling with rehearsed sorrow. She spoke of love denied, of a mother consumed by greed. Damien followed with his usual swagger, waving papers and barking about property rights. The judge listened without expression, then lifted a hand. Enough. The silence that followed cut sharper than any gavel. Wyatt stood, his tone even, and laid the evidence on the table one piece at a time. Maribel's receipts of pawned heirlooms, Miguel's affidavit describing the theft at the funeral, Jordan's decrypted recordings of threats and laughter. Each page, each voice, stacked higher until the lies collapsed under their own weight. Finally, I rose. My hands didn't shake as I placed Henry's true will before Judge Mercer, his signature, his seal, his clear words naming me as sole heir. For a long moment the courtroom was silent, even Evangeline's tears drying into stunned stillness. Judge Mercer's eyes swept the room. This court recognizes the will of Henry Hale as valid. Evangeline Hale Moore is ordered to relinquish all claims to the estate. Damien Moore, you are hereby referred for investigation into possible fraud. The gavel fell, final and sharp. Evangeline's face drained of color. Damien's bluster collapsed into silence. And I exhaled for the first time in months. The weight I had carried alone was no longer mine, and as I stepped out of that courtroom, I knew the choice of what to do next rested only with me. The months that followed felt like breathing fresh air after years underground. The estate no longer loomed as a burden of figures and contracts. It became a canvas Henry had left for me to shape. With Wyatt's guidance, the Hale Foundation was born, its charter signed in the same courthouse where Evangeline's lies had crumbled. Scholarships for widows and single mothers, apprenticeships through the trucking company, funds for women rebuilding their lives. The money no longer sat in vaults. It moved like a current into places where it mattered. I visited the first group of recipients at Texas State. Their faces, bright with hope, reminded me of the girl I once was, stretching every dollar, carrying responsibility, heavier than books. One woman pressed my hands and whispered, "This changes everything." I thought of Henry and felt him smiling through her voice. Meanwhile, Evangeline and Damien's world unraveled. Bankruptcy filings painted their names across the newspapers. Creditors circled like hawks, and their former friends in Austin society stopped answering their calls. I did not gloat. Their collapse was their own making, a tower built on greed that had finally toppled. Back at the farmhouse, I tended Henry's roses, pruning carefully, letting the thorns prick my gloves just enough to remind me of survival. The journal he left me lay on the table nearby, its last page read and reread, closing it gently. I whispered into the twilight, "I was never your burden, Evangeline. You were mine, and I've finally set it down." Then I opened a new book, blank pages waiting beneath my pen. The words came steady, not of defense or fear, but of beginnings, my own journal, my own record, no longer shadowed by betrayal. The roses swayed in the evening breeze, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath my feet was entirely mine.